Hello, my name's Elaine Young, and I want to share with you today some information on this offering of mine that is called the pleasure journey. And this journey has been in evolution since 2016, when I first offered a week-long experience into pleasure. I think actually at that time it was called Master the Power of Your Pleasure. And then it evolved to Master Your Pleasure, which I've offered in many different parts of the world and online during the global pause. And last year I felt another shift, another evolution, another change coming to this offering. And this is now the pleasure journey, which I would love you to invite you to join me if it calls you. So I want to share with you, there's lots of information on the website page. There's lots of, what is this about? What might you gain? Who is this for? So that kind of thing that I could say. But actually, as I come here today, what I want to share is something more in the essence of why I offer this. Pleasure, for many of us in many modern societies, has been shamed, has been glorified, has been a guilty pleasure, has been a sinful pleasure, has been excessive, has been a luxury. And there are many reasons why each of us has our own conditioning around when we say the word pleasure, what we even think that means, what it means to you, different from me, from someone else. When someone says pleasure, what is the word, the visual or the word that comes to our mind? It's different for all of us. Maybe when we hear the word pleasure, we expand and want to move towards it. Maybe when we hear the word pleasure, we become rigid and we contract. Maybe when we hear the word pleasure, we long for it. And maybe when we hear the word pleasure, we are terrified. Maybe when we hear it, we want it now. Maybe when we hear it, we want to delay. We feel like we have to earn it, that maybe one day I'll be worthy, or it will be time. And one of the key lessons that I learned for myself around pleasure is that it's not frivolous, that it's not indulgent, that it's certainly not sinful, that it is not just about food or sex. And that actually our capacity to receive and experience pleasure and allow pleasure is possibly one of the strongest medicines that we can dose ourselves up with, that we can nourish ourselves with. And some of you know my background for many years was working as a very mainstream medical scientist. And studied a lot of physiology and immunology and disease, and then worked in surgery where people were, very far down the line often in terms of their illnesses and very far away from health. And the more I started to experience working with pleasure in my own body and in the body of others, the more I realized, wow, this is the most powerful, potent dose of any vitamin pill you could ever take. This affects so much, so many parts of us. From our physical body to our immune system, to our mental health, to our emotional health, to our energy levels, to our joy, to our sense of fulfillment in life, our connection to our body, sometimes our connection to the divine. And pleasure is a much wider thing. It's much, much wider than, as I say, a nice meal and some lovemaking. And so in this pleasure journey, one of the main pieces is I want to offer experiences for you to figure out what is pleasure for you, and to understand that there's a wide range of potential pleasures. Pleasures of the mind, pleasures of the senses, the pleasure of safety, emotional pleasure, spiritual pleasure, bliss. And another key piece of this journey is understanding that like many things in our lives, our attitude, our capacity, our relationship with pleasure is linked to our early development as human beings, is linked to the phases and the experiences we have of pleasures in our early life. And therefore, we may still be being programmed and affected by those early life experiences, which may really affect, maybe in a very powerful way, our capacity for pleasure, but also maybe in a very disruptive and disconnecting way. So we are looking at the pleasures that we experience as, babies, even the effect of when we're in the womb, the basic pleasure that can come from feeling safe, from feeling held, from feeling surrendered, and actually the barriers to pleasure that can come if we cannot feel that. And if we struggle, and many of us do, there's nothing particularly abnormal with having challenges with safety on some level, on some aspects, in some ways, under some conditions, then any pleasure that we move towards or want to experience will be hampered potentially, maybe even completely blocked, distorted by the fact that actually we cannot access safety, which allows us to receive and experience and let the pleasure be. So that's one key part of this journey. What are the widths? What does pleasure actually mean? What do I like? How has my journey through early life, and maybe you've moved and shifted a lot of those patterns from early life. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. Maybe you actually have a very high pleasure capacity and you're coming to join us because you want more breadth, more depth. The other thing to share is that we all have this piece called the pleasure ceiling or the pleasure limit that, as adults is primarily now a self-determined, a self-set limit. But, in the past, it may have come from someone else, from somewhere else. And this is the amount of pleasure that we are able to experience without checking out, without saying that's enough, without distraction, without shame, without boredom, which is another form often of distraction and avoidance. And so another piece of this week is understanding or an opportunity rather, to see where is my limit? Where is my self-imposed limit? Maybe I understand where it comes from. Maybe I have no idea. It doesn't matter. How can I now, as a responsible, adult with agency, expand that. And perhaps your pleasure limit ceiling is very high in some aspects. Maybe you have vast amounts of capacity for emotional pleasure, maybe even sensual pleasure. But perhaps when it comes to pleasure in the mind and the mental body, or pleasure in sexual pleasure, there's a lower threshold. And during the week, we will be, through experiences and also through a series of questions and inquiries, beginning to understand, like, potentially, what's behind my belief in pleasure, what's behind the things that limit my pleasure, and there are many. The fear of being overwhelmed, the fear of being lost and engulfed, the fear of not deserving, the fear of disappointment if that pleasure is then lost, the fear of judgment, the fear of shame, the cultural and religious and family programming around it being more pure and more noble to give and to sacrifice than to allow pleasure. And as I talk about receiving pleasure and allowing pleasure, one of the biggest, most powerful things that I ever heard was the first time someone said, pleasure is not something someone else can ever give you. Pleasure is something that is a sensation you feel, or an emotion, or a thought in your body, in your mind, in your emotions. And you are the only one that can allow that. So we also have quite a lot of codependency created around pleasure, quite a lot of trading, feeling responsible for the pleasure of others, making others responsible for our pleasure. So in the previous iterations of this journey, it was very important to me to name this journey, Master Your Pleasure. Really bringing back ownership and understanding that, you are the one responsible for, and who gets to choose and create and expand your own pleasure. And in many ways, until you can do that, it can be very difficult at times to receive pleasure where others are part of that. There's nothing wrong with, allowing yourself to experience pleasure from someone else's generosity or actions or touch. So we're not making that wrong or bad or impossible. But it's really understanding that first and foremost, pleasure is something that I have to be open to. I have to be willing to allow, to feel. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what anyone else does. And in that comes empowerment, and in that comes the possibility of more healthy relating, less transactional relating. I started off this video, if you're still with me, well done. This was not intended necessarily to be this long, but today, for some reason, I'm in quite a talkative mood. I shared about, why I feel pleasure is important. And I want to share, like, from a personal experience, that I think I was given a fairly good grounding, not too religiously, despite the wider Roman Catholic Irish background of my grandparents. And my parents did pretty well on not passing on that generational. And this brings me to another point, which sometimes it may be your current personality, your life circumstances, or it can be ancestral and DNA programming that is affecting your pleasure capacity. It can be something to do with what's the soul journey that you brought in. But despite having, a reasonably good permission and example of pleasure being a healthy thing, in the area of sexuality, there was for me, a lot of outsourcing, a lot of pleasure in sexuality being mind-driven. There was not always full inhabitation of my body and its sensations. There was not always full connection to the other for various reasons of vulnerability, of energy and old stuff in my body that was in the way of me feeling fully. So there can be a default to fantasy and externalizing images and pornography. And quite often we're able to experience much more turn on in the brain than in the body. And in sexuality, particularly, who is this pleasure for? Am I actually allowing myself to be in pleasure and receive, or am I constantly trying to please someone else? Or am I actually, on the other end of the scale, completely disconnected and selfish around the other person's needs or wants or desires? And am I just taking for myself, without consent, pleasure from someone else's body? So for me, there was a huge lesson, gift, learning, a complete transformation of my experience of my body and of intimacy with myself and with others when I started to really dive into this medicine of pleasure. Yeah. And learning and unlearning what pleasure is for us, and really starting to appreciate the subtlety of, the pleasure that comes from being in nature, pleasure that comes from a deep, heartfelt conversation with a friend, pleasure that comes from actually just feeling like you can rest, like your nervous system can rest, you can close your eyes, you can breathe, you can let go of the vigilance. And for some of us, that comes very naturally, and for others, that is not something they experience. Because of sets of circumstances, they are held in this waiting for something to happen level of vigilance, hypervigilance. Quite often in our intimate relating, there's a lot of time and energy given to sexual pleasure, and then there's not so much given to sensuality. And for many of us, sensuality is something that can really open the body prior to sexual engagement. But because we live in a world where we're bombarded and overstimulated and always externalized, or perhaps there's too many sensations, so we learn to shut down, we can have lost connection to these senses. So this week is not just about physical pleasure or just about pleasure in the sexual realms of sexuality. But it does understand that some of our sexual or sensual pleasure can be shut down because of our incapacity to access pleasure in other areas, in basic safety and emotion in our mind, and that those pleasures actually are just as valid and just as important. It's almost like if all I do every day is just, eat one type of food with one nutrient, where am I giving my body everything it needs? And the same is true of pleasure. If all of your pleasure is always accessed from one point, there can be a malnutrition of other parts of us in terms of the pleasure that we have in our life. And the 8th level of this pleasure model is called spiritual bliss. And this for me was something that, and perhaps for many, sometimes in early life, for children or teenagers or times when we're in nature or in lovemaking, we have those moments when it feels like our awareness explodes, expands, disappears. We feel the euphoric feeling of this bliss and the reason, you know. Some people are very attracted to taking recreational drugs or the conscious plant medicines can be to access this feeling of oneness, dissolution, of union, of forgetting ourselves for a moment. And that is the 8th level, this model. And this is something that, you know, we're not going to be teaching you techniques to access. But when we widen and deepen and expand all of the others, we have more potential, more opportunity to touch into that, or actually maybe to start traveling deeply, consciously, regularly in that area of spiritual, sexual bliss. Sensual. May or may not be connected with sexuality, may be connected with nature, may be connected with meditation, may be connected with praying, may be connected with just the beauty of art, music. So if you've listened this long, well done. And thank you. Thank you for receiving me and listening. And I would love to meet you there on the pleasure journey. If and when that is your call. And if it's not, I also just wish you many other opportunities in life to expand your nourishment and the gift of pleasure in your life.